Good afternoon and welcome. If this is not the panel you think it is, this is the panel that is going to talk about how governments are working with miners to reduce permitting and approval timeframes. We've got an amazing panel who I invite to introduce themselves in a minute from both government, Quebec government and industry. But let's just frame this in the way that I think the question was posed at the beginning. The ability of the resources sector to position itself to take advantage of the resources financial cycles is a fine art. And if you've just been listening to Richard Shoddy, you'll appreciate it's a fine art in a casino game of roulette. And in that ability for companies to succeed, we often hear the complaint that the role that government assessments and the time taken for explorers and miners to get their regulatory approvals has impeded people's success or delayed the ability to access the all-important capital at the right time of the market when it's there and it's flexible. There are many ideas around on what does or does not contribute to this, but or indeed, depending who you are, on whether the situation actually exists or it's just a convenient excuse. And if we also overlay in that, because we will touch on that a bit later, we're in a time of boom in the renewable energy sector, is developing projects not just in Australia but globally, who are in some jurisdictions getting access to expedited procedures and often working in areas with exploration and mining interests layered on top of where they're choosing to construct. And so the interactions with these sectors, their interaction with the finite social and resource capital in those areas is becoming a live topic that can affect not just one but everybody who has an interest in that landmass. So we'll touch on that a bit later. So with that as our backdrop, we'll kick off with our panel and introduce Patrice Roy from Quebec Government. Patrice, would you like to introduce yourself briefly?
Yes, Patrice Roy. I'm Director for Geological Information and Promotion at the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry in Quebec, Canada.
That was good. Kate Dickson from AMEC.
Kate Dickson, General Manager Operations at AMEC. AMEC is a national mining industry association representing over 580 member companies around Australia.
Right. And Christo Visser from Worley.
Thank you. Christo Visser, I'm the Vice President responsible for growth of the resources sector for Worley across Europe, Middle East and Africa. Worley is second largest engineering company in the world. Got about 50,000 people across 45 locations.
And next we have Travis Inman, Executive Director, EPA Services in the Western Australian Department of Water and Environmental Regulation.
Thanks, Alex. So Travis, I lead the Environmental Protection Authority for Western Australia, so all the approvals and such.
And last by no means left to least is Ben Zammit, who's South Australian Executive Director for Regulation at the Department for Energy and Mining.
Thanks, Alex. So, Benjamin Zammit, Executive Director for Regulation and Compliance, and I look after the mining, exploration, upstream oil and gas and renewable energy component for the South Australian Government.
Thank you. So you can see there's a very diverse range of views here. So what we thought we would do would start with a few industry's perspectives, drop into some government and then come in for quite a robust discussion on the other side. So Kate, I thought from AMEC's perspective, as a scene setting, what is the view? How do you think industry sees the question of approvals and the timeframes around regulatory approvals as they intersect with their project development?
So our members are telling us that their main issues around timeframes, although they want certainty, and having certainty around mining approvals is really important for our members. Time is money, so the quicker we can get approvals, the better, but they still need to go through the robust process so that they've got the right governance and frameworks in place. So having the right approvals, taking the right amount of time is what our members really need.
And so I will now jump to government, and I'll start with Ben, because you were last to introduce, so you can be first to respond. From the South Australian perspective, what are your thoughts on approvals, timeframes? What is the South Australian government doing? They're looking at this question of timelines.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. I think assessment timeframes is something that we face, and I face on a daily matter. People always ask when it is. I think what we've seen is our standard and published timeframes have been out there for a number of years now, and we largely meet those timeframes. But we are recognising that the complexity of projects is changing depending on where they are. So location is important. So what we're embarking on, and it's something that we are embracing, is scoping, is working early with project components to ensure that we understand the specific location and what a project needs. And what community needs to ensure that government as an honest broker for community can get an assessment over the hurdles it needs to and get the approvals and get people on the ground in a timely manner.
And I will just pick up on a comment you made about publishing the timelines. Are you finding, notice we have been in a period where finance was easier to access, arguably it's a bit slower at the moment. How has the South Australian Government's performance in that timeframe piece gone?
I think when the market is humming and money is there, the urgency comes along, and you see more come into the market. So when money is flowing, more people are putting things in the door, which puts pressure on regulators. We have a finite resource, and we have to decide. I decide how we allocate those resources, but we are also managing timeframes in a way in which we're looking to invest in the projects that are ready to be invested in from our side as well.
Thanks, Ben. And Travis, from a Western Australian government perspective, on some of the things you're doing to expedite and the time of timelines that you're able to deliver.
I sure can. Thanks, Alex. I think we're in a unique position in Western Australia that we probably had many a review around approvals timeframes for the last decade or so, but in the last year, we are genuine about reform to transform how those commitments around approvals reform translate into real outcomes. And so those familiar with Western Australia, we had an independent review done last year, which was very short and sharp, but it identified 39 recommendations, of which governments adopted 34, and we're on track to achieve 75% by the end of the year. And I think it's important to stress that the outcome that we're seeking there is not to compromise standards around environmental protection, but it is to make the process much more efficient, much more predictable, and much more customer orientated around service delivery. So there's been really good engagement from West Australian government and leadership around that, and legislation. I think resourcing has been important, resourcing not to do approvals but to do transformation and bringing in some different thinking there, and probably that combination of resourcing and different leadership has driven, I'd say, probably the most important reform, and that's about cultural change. And so we're really seeing the benefits from that, and for sure we're also seeing that change inevitably makes people uncomfortable, and so we're seeing consequences of that as well. But I think my caution to industry is it takes a while for those changes to take effect. And if I look at our published performance at the moment, it's going backwards, and the main reason it is because we're assessing and approving all the ones that have been with the department for many years, and obviously make our stats then look bad. So look, nothing worth doing is easy, and I think the approvals reform journey in Western Australia has not been easy, but I do feel like it's a once in a lifetime opportunity to do it well, and that's certainly what I'm proud to be part of.
Thanks, Travis.
Alex, can I just pick up on
Okay,
something Travis
please.
just said? Hearing governments say things like customer instead of proponent, it's very refreshing from an industry perspective.
And I think, thanks. But I think the important thing to pick up on there is we do cost recovery in Western Australia. So the moment you start charging a company to do an assessment, they become the cost customer. And there was a bit of angst and, let's say, pushback when we introduced that. But I think the main message has been it's allowed us to connect resourcing to workload. So if we have a core assessment team and is doing, that we use to do the higher risk approvals, if there's an overflow based on demand, we outsource that and oversee it. So that I think we can't expect governments to do more with the same all the time, and cost recovery and that customer orientation has allowed us to connect the resourcing with workload.
We will go to Patrice, but can I pick up on that and just ask, particularly for people who may not be familiar with the WA system, Who do you outsource to?
Consultants.
And are they put through a government training or an accreditation that they have to hold, or is it literally a panel?
No, so we have a procurement panel that assesses and evaluates based on, meeting a whole bunch of different criteria, and then we retain accountability, but we, let's say, delegate responsibility to do the work. And I'll stress it is risk-based, so it's typically the post-assessment management plans or the minor amendments, administrative amendments to approvals.
Thank you. Patrice, I know we all talked together before this, but in Quebec, you've also been focusing on the ability to create efficiency for miners and explorers in approval timeframes. Would you like to share your approach with us?
Yes, exactly. We know that permitting is more and more complex. So we need to be more efficient as a government. And well, as it's more complex, well, we have a Mining Act, we have environmental laws, both at the federal and provincial or state level. We need also to work with the communities where the mines are developed. So there's a lot to coordinate and to help also the companies to navigate through that complex permitting process. We implemented a right coordination bureau that is there to help the mining companies at the development stage. So companies that have at least completed the preliminary economic assessment and are now looking at the economics of the project, so they can consult that bureau, and they will help companies navigate through the permitting process, and to be more efficient, do the right things at the right time, and works.
And have you seen any gains? Have you seen improvements in the timeframe?
Yes, we did. For example, just for bulk sampling, for example, it's 30% faster than it was in the past. So of course, there's still a lot of improvement to be done, but what we see is that by taking the time to look at the process to help companies, we can go faster without neglecting the high environmental standard that we want to have as modern mining jurisdiction.
Thanks, Patrice. And now I invite Christo, and Christo is doing some very interesting work from a different perspective outside of government. Christo, could you share what you're seeing play out in some jurisdictions on how to manage this expedited?
Thank you, Alex. I think before I get to a more granular level, I want to cast the audience back to 2019, 2020 when we had COVID, and there we went through the same process. But the difference between what we're experiencing today and back then we believed there's a crisis. We believed that we need to work together to make something happen. So in a very short period of time, through this belief that there's a crisis, governments, the pharmaceutical industry, everybody got together and created the vaccines. So for me, that is the kind of the first, overall aspect that we need to realize that believe there is an issue. Secondly, back then, during COVID, if we stay there, I was based in Western Australia, and, the Premier back then, Mark McGowan, met with industry on several occasions to determine, how do we keep the mines open? How do we keep the mines operating? How do we protect the workforce against COVID in these mines? And, I think the same happened in Queensland. But if we think back again then, the money, the foreign revenue generated by the government back then, through that discipline, through that collaboration between government, between the various industry bodies and the miners, we managed to create a lot of revenue for Australia. Probably buffered Australia against, some bad economic decisions. So I think that's the first one. And then if you look at the region that I kind of look after within Worley, let's start at European Union. So the European Union introduced their Critical Minerals Act, I think it was last year in Brussels. And part of that act is to actually get approvals through quicker, to get projects shovel ready and entered into the market quicker to support their demand for critical minerals and to be less dependent on other parts of the world for that critical mineral. And under that act, they aim to have approvals within 27 months, which is a lot quicker than some of our mines, you know, where it can take 144 months to get an approval. So I think that's the first one. Then if you go to Central Asia and you look at countries, you know, Central Eastern Europe, you look at countries like Turkey, Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, where the governments actually have signed up, in Uzbekistan's case, have signed up a deal with the European Union to supply them with critical minerals by a certain date. So what has the government done in that instance? So in that instance, they've actually established an entity. So that entity, you know, I won't say the name, but that entity established by the Uzbekistan government is responsible for the development and getting projects shovel ready to either continue development for the government because they have an obligation not only to their community but also to the European Union to get these mines up and running. So in all of that, they also do this to international standards because they are looking for foreign investment. They're not going to, you know, create any shortcuts. So companies, you know, similar to Western Australia, you know, like Worley, we work hand in glove with the government to help them through the approval process. And sometimes we do things in parallel. You know, we will start finalizing their drill program, do the metallurgical test program, whilst in parallel we go through the approvals process and the environmental impact assessment of those mines to get them, you know, to operation a lot quicker. And at the end of the day, you know, governments like Uzbekistan, Turkestan, you know, they see the mineral resources as kind of belong to the people, and the people own it. So they want to see how much value they can add to that deposit, to that mineral resource before they want to sell it or develop it themselves. And you know, there are quite a lot of examples. Like I said, they're doing it in Azerbaijan, in Uzbekistan, where we're doing a lot of work for the government. Turkey, we're doing a project in Turkey as well for the Turkish Wealth Fund, and exactly the same.
So that's a very different perspective than the Australian and the Canadian jurisdictions. Now I'll open up for thoughts and comments, and I might start with Kate from an industry view there on Australia, but also the Christo's example and what you might think of that.
Yeah, so in Queensland, the government's looking at trying to do some baseline environmental studies in certain areas to try and help kickstart parts of the industry, particularly the case study they're looking at is around Julia Creek and the vanadium projects up there. But it's really hard getting that sort of stuff up and running, deciding which baseline studies to do. It's such a large area. Do you focus on groundwater, vegetation, flora? Like it's just a can of worms. So we're sort of conflicted around, you know, what sorts of pre-work should be done and where government fits in that. And we're kind of landing that it would be really good to have some baseline studies to help expedite those projects. But it'd be great to have a look at some of those case studies to see where it's working well and how we can apply that in different jurisdictions.
I think ultimately the government knows what they're going to prove and not approve. You know, they've set the statutory framework, and everybody will operate in that framework, and they'll get the approvals according to that framework. So if the government's in a position to actually help that and move it forward, I think it will contribute a lot to the growth and the development of new critical minerals, especially in Australia.
But it's hard when you say government because often within governments they don't talk to each other. So we're finding in Queensland that the Department of Resources is really helpful and proactive, whereas the Department of Environment, Science and Innovation, who would need to collaborate on these baseline studies, less proactive.
And Patrice, did you want to comment on that, noting that I think one of the pieces that Quebec's developed is the Rights Coordination Bureau, which is very much focused on breaking down the barriers that Kate just mentioned about governments talking with themselves?
Well, if I understand well, the question of the baseline studies, we have the same in Quebec. Like the environment, they would like that we do environmental impact study at the large scale, but we don't necessarily have the tools or the time or to do that. And well, it would pretty much probably, I think, prolong the permitting process instead of getting it faster. So that's why in our environment, I think that working with the companies and the community answer the preoccupation of the communities, but doing it with the companies and the specific project, for me, probably a more efficient way to work in our own mining ecosystem.
Thanks, Patrice. And a question for Travis and Ben, because I know South Australia and WA both have really well-respected resource gateways online to get into the data, the geological data, the geochemistry. We're well aware most governments usually have some sort of water access point, but Kate's point about the value that there would be in broader environmental data, yet government is the one touch point for all sorts of environmental data. Is this something that you're looking at on how do you open up the very broad environmental data sets that must cross your desk, which don't currently exist in the public domain?
Yeah, I might start.
Go for it.
Right? And, yeah, so, I mean, specific to Western Australia, there's the, we call them WAMSI and WOBSI, the WA Marine Science Institute and the WA Biological Science Institute. Great acronyms, but they're really bodies that are there to facilitate research, and I guess they have been in a third party that's been able to receive data from a lot of the players in Western Australia, and I'm talking about the mining industry, and they've been able to use that data, collaborate without the miners themselves having to worry about anti-competitive behaviour or whatever. So there's definitely been some really good inroads in that respect. The other point I'd make, and I've made this to a number of resource companies, I think we survey too much, right? I think we set a benchmark that is, we expect things to be really, really well understood, and we survey them to death for multiple years, and this is what's adding to all the approval timeframes. And I think if you can take a step back early on and look at what's the landscape saying and just go, look, it's not the unknown it once was. You can look at what other people have done. You can go, all right, well, this habitat is probably going to have matters of national environmental significance. Let's just accept that up front and not have 3 or 4 years of surveys trying to prove what we already know. And if you start taking that high-level approach early on and you apply the mitigation hierarchy and avoid those values, now that's something, obviously, from a mining industry perspective, would result in a quicker front-end process before government starts assessing.
Ben, I know you have a view.
Yeah, I think that something similar is happening in South Australia. I think that there's two parts. One is explorers, mining companies, infrastructure, developers hold a huge amount of data that government doesn't have access to. And most of them don't have any real opposition to sharing it, but there's no avenue to share it. And governments being disparate and not talking to each other. So we've been working quite closely with our environment department to have those the ability to collect that data, and we're working on the framework on how do you legislatively make it a requirement to sort of submit that data and to hold it centrally to help with what Travis is talking about having that pre-competitive data. It's similar to how a core library works. We have pre-competitive environmental data. The challenge is creating the avenue to collect the data and then having someone to curate it. So I think there's an immense value in collecting it, but having the systems and processes to manage it is really important. But there's of immense value to the state for lots of things, not just for the mining sector. The other aspect that we're working on is we're looking at a new piece of legislation in South Australia, the Biodiversity Act, and that's starting to look at these bioregions. So high-level studies of bioregions, and then as development happens, to populate that data. So it won't be full on day one, but the best time to start is now. We should have started 10 years ago, but we can't go back in time. But to collect that data and to work with our environment colleagues and the NGOs who hold a lot of this data too, really helps us focus activity and then to hone in on the studies. So when you do have to do a study, do it in the right area for the right thing, and you cut those, the time down. Because what we're finding is mining and exploration companies find out more about our natural environment than any other sector. They're the ones out there looking for objects that we didn't even know existed. In South Australia, there's a naked mole rat, which is only ever found by exploration companies. And that's, it's challenging when it's protected and you go out there looking and you find these things.
Sorry, that was an intro about just stop looking for the naked mole rat and you'll stop finding it.
Might find a hairy mole rat.
Don't, let's not go there, the pain point. So am I right in saying that the company information will be fed to inform the bioregion data sets that the Department of Environment will then put together?
That's the intent. The intent is to have an avenue for it to come in. So a lot of the time it's collected, but it's not asked for.
Okay.
And there's no mechanism to collect it. So it's about creating the mechanism in the repository. That needs to be resourced. So government has to sort of sit behind that and resource it. And the challenge is that it sits between two departments. And it's incumbent on us as government to make sure there's an avenue for that.
Christo, you look
No,
like
no,
you-
I was going to say, it sounds to me like government's using industry to build your database, to get in all the information that government should get in the first instance, instead of assisting industry to try and get to the mines operating quicker so they can get royalties.
Look, I think part of it is that, and that's not to say that we're not doing our own work in the background, but why would a piece of work that is there to facilitate the construction of a mine be wasted to the next, we're not lifting the next, not floating all boats with regards to the information that's collected.
No, I suppose my reservation on that, or my comment on that would just be, that's going to add additional time frame to, the approval process. I mean, if we go and we say we want to be like the European Union, we want to get approvals in 27 months and we're going to have a single point of contact, then maybe from an industry point of view as well, we could put more resources into the exploration, into the development to get it, get our approvals a lot quicker, let's say in the 27 months. And maybe in that same time, the industry can also contribute and maybe do some things in parallel. Maybe you can have a more of an aggressive drilling program to get your resource rolled out a lot quicker, because in 27 months you're going to have your approval process, not in 144 months. So I think there's something that industry can do as well. If we can get those time frames from the various governments where they aspire to achieve approvals within a certain period of time.
I think having a central source of information would be really helpful in all different governments, because we find in exploration you're reporting where you're going to drill to the Department of Resources, to that regulator, and then you need to report to the environmental regulator the same long data. It's like you're exporting the same information from the company to different regulators. It's the same information. So you're splitting the data from the source.
I'll just pick up, and Patrice, I will come back and ask the same question of Quebec, but I know that WA and South Australia have both had quite significant projects to digitise the assessment processes and procedures for reporting. It might be interesting to the audience to be able to update on that and how that may inform Kate's observation about the inefficiency between government departments.
Yeah, I mean, I think Kate's absolutely correct. There definitely could be greater sharing between government departments. Digitisation's the platform for doing that. It's not a quick fix. I think with the Border Environment Online, we've spent 28 million on it. We're spending another 10 per year for the next 4 years. At the end of it, I hope, Kate, it's like you described, but yeah, the demand for IT services is pretty competitive at the moment, and it's been probably our biggest barrier to doing that. Incidentally, Christo, I think you can be a bit more ambitious. I think we can do better than 27 months.
Well, I mean, if you can, great.
Yeah, so
WA can.
we're aiming for 80% in 12 months. Yeah, that's so we've currently seen 4 years in some instances. I heard this morning, there's probably two sides, but we're really trying to drive for most projects something around the 12-month target. So yeah, but going to beat the European Union.
Ben, have you got any thoughts you want to throw in there?
Yeah, and so we're going through our own digitisation process at the moment with the first phase of hopefully to be many. I wish I had the budget that you had, Travis, for a project, but it's I think the opportunity lies in in what AI offers, what big data offers, and I think the more we can feed the machine with data, the much easier the algorithm can spit out consistent answers with regard to impact. You know, we're looking for risk. We're treating the risk. We're not treating the standard. Feeding that is important, and the first step is having a platform that can be built on that allows the simplified reporting, but also the simplified assessment from the other side. I think, you know, when we talk about assessment timeframes, and I'll be really interested. You know, we aim for a 12-month. But when does that start? Does that start from when the company starts gathering data, or when we, as government, start assessing? So we hold our time frame, but we don't control how long it takes to get to us. But what we do is we control the aspect of what we're asking for. So for us to be really clear up front, provide as much information we can up front to fill in a lot of those gaps. So having a government database that fills in a lot of the grey. So we're only asking for the actual location-specific points is where we can feed. But at the end of the day, the project will determine what it is, and computer systems and IT will help. At the end of the day, you need someone at the end. You know, you need a nut on the end of the bolt. You've got to press the button and make sure that, you know, we are meeting a standard that we're all willing to accept.
So I've heard IT systems, more sharing more broadly in an easy, functional way of environmental data relying on industry. Travis, you talked about cultural change and actually looking at how the organisational efficiency, outsourcing to get help for government when the volume, depending on where we are in the cycle, comes in. I'll stick up for Christo and say also being open to different ways of doing things. In the Canadian context, is there something that you think has been a step change from an IT or a data sharing or one of those perspectives, Patrice?
Yes, well, for the IT tools, well, I agree with Travis that it's still a lot of work to develop a tool that will encompass all the permitting process. We are working on that for the exploration steps where it's much simpler. There's a lot less permitting to do. So that's manageable. That's not too big tools that are too complicated to implement. But for development, well, I think it will take time to do that. So I think that for that, working with the company is probably best way to tackle it. And well, also there's no two projects that are similar. All have their particularities. It's hard to come up and say, well, it will take 3 years or 4 years or 2 years for your project to go through permitting. Depends on the solution you will bring. Depends on the problem you encounter. So I think that for that reason, it's hard to have a specific number. But certainly we can do, we can work to get the processing more efficient. And well, I think for that we need to work more with the companies and the other ministries. Sometimes, well, like Kate said, sometimes you have 2 permits from 2 ministries, and well, they don't necessarily ask exactly the same information, but it's about the same. So we're working to harmonize those processes, and that's something we're working on. We have a new bill that's under review right now, and we proposed amendments to the delivery of the mining permit to harmonize it with the environmental permit. So that's the kind of thing.
So where you're streamlining that process.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, a lot of this has focused on what can government consider to be able to speed up government's role in granting of approval. Do you have any thoughts on, from as an industry association, what are the things that industry could do to expedite things for themselves?
I think providing the data in the format that the government wants. So a lot of the excuses that government gives back to members is not properly made applications. And so making sure that the applications meet the criteria is an important thing that industry could do, like avoiding that, you know, and often there'll be wait till the 5 o'clock on the statutory day. It's like, oh, sorry, this, you know, you forgot to dot this I and cross this T. So yeah, I think there's a lot of things that industry can do to help themselves around making sure that information's presented in the way that the regulator needs it.
If we take the last 10 minutes to kind of go a little bit sideways, but it's kind of related. And these are questions around expedited procedures. How fast is fast enough? How fast is too fast? And I use that as an example because whether it's in the EU, South America, New South Wales, the renewable sector is at times no longer the darling that it was in community eyes maybe 10 years ago. They are often getting expedited procedures. Certainly, I'm aware of projects in the EU that don't even have to do environmental impact assessments, and you look at photos of construction and you can see the landslide that will be there in 5 years. So there is fast, too fast, what's fast enough. With renewables being in the same place of mine exploration, I'd like to kind of open up for your views on either two sides. One is what is fast enough and what is too fast, because too fast can erode many things, and this confluence of the renewables and the resources sector stacking on each other in same locations but with very different expectations on the assessments that government are applying to them. Big question, but I know we've talked about it before. And I might start with Kate, if that's okay.
It's really complicated. So, of course, for my members, I think explorers should get on the land first. But really, the answer needs to stand with the state deciding on what the highest land use and what the best outcome for the community will be over the long term, and giving people and at the moment where the state's giving that up, they don't give themselves the timeframes or the legislative framework to do a reasonable assessment around what the highest land use will be and what will the best outcome for the community be. So AMEC is doing a piece of work at the moment to try and help inform different states and territories and the federal government around what's working well and what isn't, and the impact to the resources industry. Because what we're really worried about is renewable energy infrastructure sterilising mineral assets in the ground.
And Ben, would you have anything?
Yeah, I think South Australia is in a bit of a unique situation where we currently have a new piece of legislation after hydrogen and renewable energy, and on landscape scale, so we're talking gigawatt scale projects. And we are, as Kate said, we're seeing these rights stack on top of each other, and as a government regulator, I think partly lucky that it sits in the same department with the same team, that we have oversight of where things are. But the challenge is the next big mineral discovery we don't know. So maintaining the right to explore, the state kind of hedging its bets is really important. I think the challenge we have is, as we are stacking rights, and you know, add carbon farming in there and add the petroleum, and we've got hydrogen exploration, we've got CCUS happening. You know, there's a fatigue on the community with this over consultation, and there's a, you know, and we spoke about it before. I talk about a social capital where we're eroding, and renewable projects are eroding mineral resources capital that they've built over many years. On the same token, some explorers are eroding social capital on the other side, and it's important that the industries, and as a regulator, I think as government, but as a regulator myself, is ensuring that we protect that social capital and then we protect the community interest in the long term. So that's the state's right to grant access to these resources and ensuring that the right projects come in at the right time whilst not sterilising anyone's resource. Because the future is bright. There are a lot of things happening. In South Australia, we're seeing deposits being found that are traditionally not exploration ground for resources that weren't typically, or commodities that weren't typically in the mix. So I think it's an exciting time, but it's also a time where community awareness is very high, and we have to be really cognizant of managing and maintaining access.
Thanks, Ben. Christo.
I want to go on with what Ben mentioned. So, you know, I think there are lots of regulations, a lot of laws. Everything keeps on changing the whole time. I heard in another session this morning. you know, if regulators and governments believe, you know, that these, you know, entities or industry can coexist, again, you know, my urging to government would be, you know, what value is government adding to the process by being a regulator? You know, are the governments prepared to actually do something, you know, help with the approval process, own maybe, you know, and on-sell it, and in that instance create added value to the Crown or to the people of Australia that actually own those mineral resources. You know, there's one thing just being a regulator, tick a box, fill in a form, you know, it's going to take so much, compared to, you know, actually actively being a participant. If they, you know, if regulators, I'm not selfish, but if regulators, you know, think we can coexist, then I urge the governments to actually be more of an active participant in the development of these projects, in getting them shovel ready a lot quicker than what they are in today's time.
So Patrice, before I go to Travis, who's itching, Patrice, what would be a comment from a Canadian perspective? You're a very mining-rich jurisdiction on some of these observations.
Yeah, well, on your first question as to what is too fast for a project, I would say if you're skipping steps in the process, you're going too fast. You will probably crash into a wall somewhere along the road. And we have example in the past that tells us that not the right way to go. We need to be more efficient, and for that, I think that yes, we can work with the companies and maybe a more active proponent, and the companies ask that of government, but also the community. So that may be part of the answer. Well, we're trying to be more active on that part and to bridge what are the community needs or well their expectation, and the companies also on the side of the companies what they need and how we can help them to advance faster without treating social acceptability problem or other problems along the way, because that's, well, if you don't have the social acceptability, well, it's like you don't have the financing or you don't have the resources. So that's also an important element to take into account when you want to go fast. Yes, well, but do the things right so your project will advance at a steady pace.
Very good point, Patrice. Travis.
I was just going to share in West Australia, so I essentially support the Environment Minister, who's also the Energy Minister, and it's a really interesting dynamic where the state is the proponent for decarbonisation in the southwest, and so to fast track approvals in that respect, they've set up a green energy approvals unit that's dedicated to those green energy projects. But yeah, it's a really interesting tension. But I think one of the great things about renewables is you can move them around a bit. Obviously, the mining industry, the ore is where the ore is, but renewables, you've got a bit of flexibility on location of the power generation infrastructure as well as the transmission corridors. So I think go back to the earlier question, I think it'd be really cautious to have just, you know, let's just go do it. You need to have a level of assessment and rigour around that, because I don't think the social licence to operate for renewables is as widespread as we might otherwise want it to be. So there's got to be that social buy-in.
Thanks, Travis. Now, we've got only a couple of minutes left because the session's running over and we are determined to be the ones that bring it back on time. That's the kind of professionals that we are. If you would like to add one more thing on this perspective of industry, government, the role of assessments and the speed to access markets, a lot of the topics you've raised are far more complex than that simple question. If you wanted to have the last word from your perspective, what would it be?
Well, if you're a promoter and you have a project that you want to bring to production, you have to, well, work on permitting as early as possible, that you don't get you don't get any delay in your permitting process. I think it's something the promoter needs to do active early process.
Thanks, Patrice. Kate?
I think we need to level the playing field on approvals. So for mining projects and renewable projects need to go through the same level of scrutiny and adding a rehabilitation component to renewables, because mines have that as well.
That's actually a really good point. You don't often hear picked up on renewables. Christo?
Look, I want to go back to my opening statement about belief. You know, we believed that there was a threat in terms of COVID. And if we talk about the energy transition, you know, if we believe that there's a need for this energy transition and the critical minerals, you know, then I think there's a way for governments to assist and actually be an active participant, adding value to the mineral resources and then on selling it or self-develop it to, you know, for the benefit of the community.
Thanks, Christo. Travis?
I'd just like to say thanks for coming. Every presentation I went to this morning was about how government needs to do more about approval timeframes, so glad that you came to hear us out. Thanks.
And Ben, last word.
I think it's to engage with government. So these conversations have been great. You know, you have to hear it to act on it. So from a regulator's point of view, I think it's really important that we continue to engage with industry so we can make the timeframes as quick as possible.
Thank you. I hope for those that have been here for the whole time, you realise there is far more to the question than, oh, you're not fast enough, it's your fault my project didn't get up. Government, I think, has shared that there are complexities in there and many opportunities for improvement. There's some really good things that could support industry, but government can't do it all. Industry also needs to get things in the right way, think about it at the right time and collaborate with government so that you can manage it well together. We hope you learnt something new. Please join me in thanking the panel.